Greetings and welcome to the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. My name is Peter Mandeville, and I'm a senior research fellow at the center. Here at Georgetown, I lead the Berkeley Center's Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, a multi-year research initiative enabled by generous support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, dedicated to exploring and understanding the various ways that religion fits into the foreign policy and external relations of states and governments around the world. Today's program is part of this project, and we're grateful to you for joining us. Our panel today will be exploring the geopolitics of religious moderation in the Middle East and North Africa. Since 2001, various governments in the Middle East and North Africa have positioned themselves as sources and champions of moderate Islam. More recently, in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings and in the face of the challenge from ISIS, leaders in countries such as Morocco, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia have been associated with a string of conferences and summits focused on themes such as pluralism, tolerance, and coexistence. So how should we understand the nature and significance of this trend? Is it best understood as a means by which regimes can underscore their international security cooperation and counterterrorism credentials? Does it represent a religious expression of longstanding and in some cases more recent regional political rivalries? To what extent are we seeing a reconfiguration in the relationship between states, religious institutions, and Islamic scholars? To help us answer these questions, we're delighted to welcome to the Berkeley Center a panel of superb scholars whose recent research and writing has explored the relationship between the state and religion in the Middle East and North Africa. Joining us today are Dr. Yasmin Farooq of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Dr. Stacey Gutkowski from King's College London, Dr. Annie Sarkissian from Michigan State University, Dr. Anel Sheline of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and Dr. Anne-Marie Wainscott from Miami University in Ohio. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read their full and very impressive biographies, but rather, as our discussion gets started, I'll place in the chat box a series of links to their online profiles and some of their relevant publications. I'll also include a link to the main landing page for our Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project, where you can learn more about the initiative and also access the wide range of articles, working papers, and video recordings of previous talks associated with the project. We're excited that in 2021, the project will be publishing not one, but 2 edited volumes with Oxford University Press, one of which features chapters by several of today's speakers. Before I hand things over to Dr. Sarkissian and Wainscott to get our discussion started, just a few brief words about logistics in our format today. I first wanted to make sure that everyone in the audience knows that today's session will be recorded for the benefit of those who are not able to join us for the live session. Those of you who have registered for the talk will all receive a link to that video once it becomes available. After we hear the presentations from our speakers, we should have a good period of time available to us for discussion and a Q&A session. If you'd like to participate in that, you can do so using the Q&A control, which is there as part of the main Zoom control panel. If you press Q&A, you'll see a box open up and you can type your question into that. And then at the end of the presentation portion of the program, I will then put a selection of those questions and comments to our speakers. So without further ado, let me hand things over to Dr. Annie Sarkissian and Dr. Anne-Marie Wainscott to kick us off.
Thanks, Peter. I'll go ahead and start us off. Religious soft power, once a great power competition between Shia Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia, has fragmented. In the wake of the war on terror, many countries are attempting to position themselves as we might call the third pole in this long-running conflict, the moderate Muslim power that is a trustworthy ally for Western powers in the fight against religious extremism. Despite claims to the contrary, in this context, moderate really has no theological meaning. It is rather a label meant to signify acceptance of the terms of the war on terror. Indeed, we cannot separate the labeling of moderate Muslim countries from the events of 9/11 and the resulting war on terror. Mahmoud Mamdani named and in a sense predicted this development in his 2004 work, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, when he wrote, now I'm quoting Mamdani, after an unguarded reference to pursuing a crusade, President Bush moved to distinguish between good Muslims, and quote unquote bad Muslims. From this point of view, bad Muslims were clearly responsible for terrorism. At the same time, the president seemed to assure Americans that good Muslims were anxious to clear their names and conscious of this horrible crime and would undoubtedly support us in a war against them. But this could not hide the central message of such discourse. Unless proved to be good, every Muslim was presumed to be bad. All Muslims were now under obligation to prove their credentials by joining the war on terror against quote unquote bad Muslims. This dynamic quickly expanded beyond, now I'm done quoting Mahanani, back to myself. This dynamic quickly expanded beyond labeling individuals as either good or bad to labeling regimes as such. The good Muslims are the moderate Muslim powers, Morocco, Jordan. Mohammed bin Salman even assures us that Saudi Arabia will soon join the moderates. Moderate Muslim powers are those that have accepted the dichotomy of good Muslim and bad Muslim and are positioning themselves as among the former, as a mean of facilitating a kind of transactional relationship with Western countries. They seek to benefit from the material resources and prestige afforded to those countries viewed as allies in this conflict. To be a good Muslim power is to join the global war on terror, in word or in deed, or both. In an Islamic context, this has had a particular institutional configuration. Good Muslim powers take control of the religious field, for an unregulated religious field is at risk of being co-opted or dominated by quote unquote bad Muslims. Good Muslim powers dictate who can issue fatwa or Islamic legal rulings in their territory. They use appointments to control the advancement of ulama or Islamic scholars within their bureaucracies. Despite being so moderate, it is not the most creative, innovative, learned, or inspiring religious scholars who find themselves in position of authorities in good Muslim countries. For good Muslim powers elevate bureaucrats, not scholars, or they transform scholars into bureaucrats. They seem particularly fond of elevating English-speaking bureaucrats who can participate in the public relations campaign that declares their countries moderate. Good Muslim powers publish declarations, the Amman Declaration, the Marrakesh Declaration. Good Muslim powers imprison Salafis or others whose rhetoric is deemed extreme. Good Muslim powers regulate terrorism financing. Good Muslim powers remove talk of jihad from their school curriculum. There's much to gain in such a position. For good Muslim powers also get to imprison their pro-democracy activists without much condemnation. They murder their journalists in their embassies. Their monarchs appear on American late night television in expensive suits and talk about how moderate their countries are. Good Muslim powers obtain better terms of trade. They have more active tourism sectors. Who really wants to visit a bad Muslim country anyway? Good Muslim powers write distressingly vague counter-terror legislation, which they then use to imprison human rights advocates, opposition leaders, journalists, and anyone not participating in the regime's public relations campaign. Good Muslim powers interrogate these terrorists with whatever methods they desire. And here is where the contradiction lies. Good Muslim powers, it seems, aren't really moderate at all. They are just a particular brand of authoritarian. They are playing the West game, but they are the ones winning, always winning. For soft power is still power, perhaps more effective than violence. For soft power compels compliance without the use of violence or with the use of significantly less violence than would otherwise be required. And indeed, we do see that those regimes who effectively wield religious soft power seem to require less coercion in their own societies. The elevation of bureaucrats over the ulama or religious scholars as a part of this process has a number of consequences. Although it is well known that many of Islam's leading scholars over the centuries have argued for religious scholars to obey the ruler, any ruler is better than no ruler, the ulama have often also served as a check on unjust rulers. This was facilitated partially by the endowments or the waqf, which funded some religious institutions like libraries and madrasas, so that religious scholars had choices beyond working for the ruler. But the massive increase in the regulation of religion that we have seen across the Middle East since the beginning of the War on Terror has largely eliminated these independent sources of employment. As states take control of religious institutions, even long-standing independent institutions like Qarawiyyin University in Fez the ulama have fewer and fewer options outside of state-sponsored employment. Unsurprisingly, they are playing less and less of a role in critiquing, correcting, and limiting the power of the rulers of their societies. One question that scholars still need to wrestle with is how to draw this line between ulama and bureaucrats in the contemporary context. Bureaucrats do not check monarchical authority. Bureaucrats exist in a hierarchy, and their livelihood, career advancement, and reputation are all on the line. In this competition, monarchies have something of an advantage over the republics, in that their religious policies can take very long-term approaches without the inconvenient interruptions of election cycles. Take the example of Morocco. Whereas the Moroccan monarchy has wielded some form of religious soft power for centuries, this policy has been dramatically expanded in the years since the Casablanca bombings of 2003. I detail this expansion of religious regulation in my book, Bureaucratizing Islam, Morocco and the War on Terror. The Moroccan approach to religious soft power builds on a few long-standing initiatives. First, there are the Durus Hassaniya, or the Hassanian lectures, a series of lectures given every year in Ramadan that are broadcast on satellite TV around the Muslim world. The lectures, which began in the early 1960s, before the previous king, Hassan II, had even consolidated his power, have continued to draw religious scholars to both attend and participate. As the site of key pilgrimage sites, particularly for the Tijaniya Sufi Brotherhood, as well as an important center for Islamic learning, Morocco has long maintained a reputation as an important gathering place for Islamic scholars. The Durus Hassaniya further consolidated this identity over the last 60 years. Despite this history, it is only in recent years that these initiatives have been integrated into a massive soft power strategy. After the 2012 coup in Mali, Morocco began to offer its assistance to train Malian imams as a form of spiritual security. As other countries learned of the initiative, they requested that Morocco, that good Muslim power, train their religious leaders. Today, Morocco trains hundreds of imams and female murshida, or guides, in its state-sponsored institutions, spreading Moroccan Islam through its grateful foreign students. The expansion of religious regulation in the 21st century, which builds on Morocco's reputation as a center for Islamic learning, is qualitatively different than what came before. The Morocco of the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s positioned itself as a patron of Islamic communities, particularly the Tijani Sufi Brotherhood, and it sponsored the construction of mosques and the distribution of texts across West Africa. But today, Morocco is not just a patron of Islamic institutions, it is a prime producer, not only of Islamic knowledge, but also of Islamic elites, both men and women. And Morocco is not benefiting from the presence of independent religious institutions on its soil as it once was. It is rather absorbing previously independent religious institutions into its state-sponsored religious bureaucracy. In other words, the knowledge and elites produced by Morocco are filtered through state-sponsored institutions. It is, for lack of a better word, a domesticated religious field. Morocco has leveraged these strengthened relationships with foreign governments for all sorts of benefits outside of the religious sector. Morocco has dramatically expanded its role in West African banking. Morocco has rejoined the African Union. Morocco has continued to suffer attempts to break the stalemate in its territorial dispute in the south of the country. Of course, it's impossible to draw a direct connection between the religious soft power that Morocco wields at home and abroad as a moderate Muslim power, an ally in the global war on terror, and the basic free reign that the country seems to have in suppressing democratization efforts. But the scholarly literature, including the work of my colleague Ani Sarkissian, who will speak in a minute, strongly suggests that high levels of religious regulation is correlated with stalled attempts at democratization. In her 2012 article, she wrote, "Examinations of specific types of religious regulation in Muslim-majority countries uncover a pattern of repression of religious expression that may be used to mobilize citizens politically. These regulations are targeted more often at Muslims who seek independence from state-controlled religion or who wish to challenge authoritarian governments, rather than at non-Muslim minorities or at religious worship more generally. Thus, authoritarian and semi-authoritarian regimes in Muslim-majority states successfully use policies toward religion to restrict political competition and inhibit democratic transition." Back in 2004, long before the War on Terror had facilitated this expansion of the religious bureaucracies in the region, our colleague Eva Berlin argued that the strength of the security apparatus was effectively preventing democratization in the region. But it is clear that the War on Terror, which vilifies Islam and therefore provides cover for authoritarian regimes to take continuously greater control of religious institutions in the name of security, has effectively made religious bureaucracies into a wing of the security apparatus. Religious soft power is therefore yet another weapon in the authoritarian arsenal, reducing the levels of coercion necessary to draw compliance from its citizens. I will hand it over to Ani now for a few additional remarks.
Thanks, Anne. So Anne alluded to the institutional aspect of religious soft power in her discussion of the framing of good versus bad Muslims. So I'm going to expand on that briefly by presenting an overview about how this looks in practice. So if we look at the MENA countries, all of the countries except for Lebanon and Yemen, that's still undergoing conflict, have a ministry or office of religious affairs that has some level of control over Islamic practice in the country. So this includes things like appointing members of Islamic councils and imams to mosques, training clergy, writing or monitoring sermons and religious pronouncements, paying the salaries of clerics, funding mosque construction and maintenance, and even deciding where new mosques are going to be built, overseeing religious curricula and schools. Some states have taken over religious endowments and collection of zakat, so they control the financing of religion as well. And in some settings, councils of Islamic scholars review legislation for compliance with Sharia. As Anne mentioned, many, but not all Muslim MENA countries have a bureaucrat who's not a cleric that heads a religious ministry. And you have a grand mufti that is appointed as the official religious leader. The mufti is oftentimes used to help the state gain popular support for domestic policy changes or controversial foreign policy decisions, and can also play an important symbolic role, appearing alongside state leaders in official meetings and therefore tacitly sanctioning their rule. And finally, most religious ministries have an office that is dedicated to international considerations, such as ministering to its own citizens abroad, coordinating events outside the country, or outreach to non-citizens. Anne and I are currently working on a project untangling the mechanisms of religious authority in the MENA countries. And we're chronicling the various ways that states have taken over religious functions that used to be managed by an array of religious authorities. We're tracking changes in religious bureaucracy and tracing how they relate to domestic and international developments. We're also questioning the extent to which co-optation of religious authority extends into repression of independent religious expression. As most of the countries that we study are authoritarian, we're also interested in understanding how variations in authoritarian regimes, such as whether they hold elections or not, affect the strategies that rulers employ in the religious sector. As we know, context matters, so the specific actions that governments take must incorporate domestic and international considerations, goals, and constraints. So every country approaches these institutions differently. Anne has already discussed Morocco, a monarchy that operates under fewer constraints in terms of the types of actions it can take. So I'm just briefly going to talk about Turkey just for a couple of minutes. Turkey, as a republic that holds elections and is a member of NATO, has different considerations in its relations with the religious sector than Morocco does. Though it's popularly known as a secular country, the Turkish state has a great deal of control over religious practice in the country, and the relationship between religion and state, we can argue, has only increased over time. Like Morocco, the government has tried to control the version of Islam that is prevalent in the country. However, because it is elected, it has had to be more incremental in its approach. It has a version of a religion ministry in the form of the Diyanet, which governs Sunni religious expression, both inside the country and around the world. So if we look at what's happened in recent years with Turkey and the religious sector, upon first taking power, the AKP government geared its policies and image towards potential EU membership. In 2010, though, as the AKP government had cemented its power and the prospects for EU membership faded, it elevated the Diyanet's bureaucratic status and widened its jurisdiction to include consulting on draft legislation. It also increased the Diyanat's budget, making it one of the largest of all the ministries. Much of the money has gone to personnel, including establishing a family and moral guidance bureau through which imams offer moral support and guidance to families, workers, youth, and women, allowing the reach of the official ulama to extend into the private sphere and to work on changing society from below. This means that the ulama become an arm of the state, working to advance the morals and values of the governing party and rooting out alternative visions, including the purge of former allies, the Gulenists. Funding has also gone to expanding Turkey's influence around the world, including building mosques for Muslim communities in Africa and Asia, and framing itself as the model Muslim democracy to the West and a defender of Muslims to those that are not in the West. This is also in direct competition with the activities of its former ally and current enemy, the Gulenists, who are masters of religious soft power. And I can expand on this more in the Q&A if people are interested. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ani. And the project you two are working on together sounds amazing, and really looking forward to seeing what comes out of that. So we will go ahead and move on and turn the virtual room over to Dr. Stacy Gutkowski. Stacy, over to you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Peter. So I'm going to be using my time now to talk about Jordan. And Jordan is an interesting case for considering how do small states play the moderation language game. Jordan's been asserting its political moderation to Western audiences since the 50s. And this nation branding as part of what Curtis Ryan has called Jordan's omnibalancing between its Western and Arab funders. Now, Jordan mobilizes for dimensions of Islamic legitimacy, sometimes for moderation branding and sometimes for other things. So for Arab and Muslim audiences, it stresses its guardianship of Al-Aqsa and the Hashemites' prophetic descent. Since 9/11, it has targeted Western audiences through the promotion of interfaith pluralism and harmony. The 2007 A Common Word Between Us and You message to Christian leaders is one example of this. And then since the Arab Spring, distancing itself from Salafi jihadism and at times its own Muslim Brotherhood opposition has played well with Gulf funders as well, not just the West. So in Jordan, there's a small religious soft power ecosystem, to use Mandeville and Hamid's phrase. It revolves around two main areas. One is moderate Islam. This has been evolving since the 1980s, which is also when the state took over promotion of proper Islamic practice, which it had previously outsourced to the Muslim Brotherhood. The other policy area is interfaith harmony. And this precedes 9/11 and has been evolving since 1994, when Jordan signed the Wadi Araba Treaty with Israel. Activities are run by 3 royal institutions, a handful of civil society organizations, and the traditional churches. And this is important because in Jordan, the traditional churches are important for understanding its religious soft power. It's a small state. Much of the work is personality driven and funding is limited. And a post-2015 Islamic revival in the public sphere beyond the official state narrative has complicated things. But in Jordan, there are really 3 more intensive periods of activity. One in the 90s, one after 9/11, and one after 2014-15, when Jordan joined the US-led coalition in Syria. Now, during the 2000s and 2010s, Jordan really had a mixed bag of success, mixed success in marketing moderation. Mainly because religious soft power is about mutual relationships. It's not just about nation branding. Somebody has to respond to you. So if you trace the money, you can see that Jordan attracted substantial US and to a lesser extent European overseas development funding. But this is gained through actions, not words. Proving itself a reliable partner on Iraq, on terrorism, and also on refugees. In terms of the region, in 1 year, it attracted over 200 signatories from 16 Arab states, Iran and Turkey for its showpiece 2004 Amman message. But in the 2010s, Jordan was rapidly outspent by better funded states like Turkey, Qatar, Morocco, and Egypt. Now, promoting an anti-Daesh, anti-Al-Qaeda idiom played well in Riyadh and also in Abu Dhabi. Again, if you follow the money, Jordan received investment in exchange for military support in Bahrain and in Syria and through hosting Syrian refugees, but not as much as expected or needed. By early 2019, its public debt was running at 95% of GDP. Part of the reason for the shortfall in funding is partially because it refused to fully align itself with Saudi Arabia against Qatar during the blockade. Just as an example of religious soft power relationships, in 2019, a Saudi-Jordanian political dispute erupted through a religious idiom over who is the legitimate custodian of Al-Aqsa. Now, it was provoked by the US deal of the century, and it was about money and also Qatar, but it was expressed via Al-Aqsa. And the dispute was short-lived, but it shows that religious soft power is about competition and not just cooperation or wooing. Still, by the early 2010s, despite Prince Razi's successful 2010 campaign to get the UN to adopt World Interfaith Harmony Week, which it did, this policy area suffered what Anil has rightly called neglect due to lack of funds. And now I want to look at just briefly at the post-2014 period, because things changed in September 2014. Jordan joined the US-led coalition in Syria, and it also introduced new counterterrorism legislation. Now, sadly, Jordan also experienced 5 attacks by gunmen inspired by Islamic State between November 2015 and December 2016. There was normalization of anti-Shia and anti-Christian hate speech on Jordanian social media. And this was part of a broader trend of reassertion of austere Islamic identity in the public sphere. Jordan revived its external-facing Islamic moderation discourse during this period. Prince Razi organized an open letter by leading religious scholars to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, refuting his declaration of a caliphate. And the king spoke explicitly about Islamic moderation to the UN and also to the Jordanian people on several occasions, including while justifying Jordan's entrance into the war and following Daesh's release of the video of the tragic death of a Jordanian Air Force pilot. Now, having already long positioned itself as committed to wasatiyah, to centrism, prior to the rise of Daesh, Jordan was one of several states in a strong position to attract a new round of Western funding for countering violent extremism. Sarampos has written elsewhere about Jordan's refugee rentierism as a way to bring in extra money through hosting refugees. And I think we can also say that it engages in what I call a moderation rentierism. As in the West, this has helped fund countering violent extremism strategies since 2016. But this has also ended up securitizing other civil society activities, for example, related to youth and to refugees. However, this post-2014 phase has been marked by what I call a simultaneous secularization of Jordan's domestic approach since the 2000s, with the security services leading institutionally rather than religion-related royal institutions or civil society. The Community Peace Center in the Public Security Directorate leads on counter-ideology and de-radicalization. State efforts to control preaching in informal and formal mosques intensified after the passing of the counterterrorism legislation in 2014, with even tighter, more intrusive guidance from the Ministry of Islamic Affairs on the Friday khutbah and increased surveillance of social media and Islamic religious charitable activity. Now, just to conclude, interestingly, the regime has promoted a potential civil state in response to December 2018 street protests and calls for economic and political reform and an end to corruption. And also interestingly, this idea has been found to be somewhat acceptable to parts of its now fractured and ostensibly dissolved Islamist opposition as a possible thin wedge through which to push for reform. So the story of moderation in Jordan is very complicated. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Stacy. I can already see that we have a nice steady stream of questions rolling in. So again, for those of you in the audience who may have joined us a little late, you can participate or begin to participate in the Q&A portion of our program at any time simply by clicking the Q&A button on your Zoom controls, and that'll open up a window where you can type in a question for our speakers, and I will put a selection of those questions to the panel when we wrap up. But we still have two fantastic presentations to go, and so we're going to go ahead and move straight over to Dr. Yasmin Farooq. Yasmin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for inviting me here today. Actually, to talk about this subject, there is a photo that I very much like to, use that I could not use here. I could not show here for copyright reasons, of course. But in my talk today, I'm going to talk about Saudi Arabia, and that picture was actually when all the narrative about reform in Saudi Arabia started. You had a picture circulating on, especially Egyptian Facebook. Half of the picture was, a Saudi woman refusing to shake the hands of Prince Harry of England, and the other half is a Saudi woman, wearing the traditional abaya, veiled, but shaking the hand of the Saudi crown prince. And it had in an Egyptian dialect a sentence saying, "Oh, haven't you heard the hadith that prohibited shaking the hands of men?" It was actually proven to be weak. And to me, that picture was very much representative of what's going on not only inside Saudi Arabia, but also how is it perceived outside Saudi Arabia. Because when you talk about the geopolitics of religion and start talking about Saudi Arabia, it is kind of, a bigger deal than when it's these kind of changes in the religious sphere are happening in other countries, such as the countries that were mentioned today. This kind of picture to me, first of all, the circulation and the talk about what's going on inside Saudi Arabia by other Muslim communities showed that, what happens again in the religious sphere inside Saudi Arabia doesn't stay in Saudi Arabia. It really reverberates beyond it. And that's because the country has always, the kingdom has always presented itself as being the embodiment of true Islam. This is what an Islamic state, an Islamic society is supposed to look like. And has always, and until today, Saudi scholars talk about the specificity of Saudi Arabia because of the custodianship of the two holy mosques. Well, what we're seeing today in Saudi Arabia is actually this specificity instead of, limiting the capacity of the state to change in the religious realm or limiting it to, like in the past, liberalized society, for example, is being used as an asset to empower the new political authority in Saudi Arabia, represented by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, to give credit to keep this specific Islamic label while undergoing radical changes in the Islamic realm. We're still the embodiment of Islam, but actually this embodiment is changing, and what embodying true Islam means is also changing. Another thing that I liked in this photo is actually compared to what happened in the religious realm in Saudi Arabia between 2001 and 2011. Starting 2011, when you talk about moderation in Saudi Arabia, there is a heavier political print than the one that existed before, in the sense that after September 11th, the ideological effort was more pronounced than it is today. Today, you don't really have in all these calls of moderation inside Saudi Arabia and moderating Islam inside Saudi Arabia. You do not have, until today, a serious doctrinal debate that actually discredits or invalidates some of the previous doctrines, or actually the current doctrines, the current Saudi doctrine, the Wahhabi doctrine, up front. You have it in some indirect ways, in the sense of, for example, again, the social liberalization that we saw that indirectly invalidate some of the previous Wahhabi interpretations, but without saying that, oh, the Wahhabi doctrine was wrong, or we're changing the Wahhabi doctrine. To the contrary, the narrative today is to say that, originally the Wahhabi doctrine is moderate, but what happened started in 1979 is what radicalized the Saudi state and radicalized the Saudi society. So we're actually going back to the real Wahhabi doctrine. This also political, the inflation of the political dimension of moderation today is also seen in the fact that the basis of what is moderate today inside Saudi Arabia, as reflected in the official narrative and in the changes and the actions taking place inside the religious space, is actually opposition to political Islam in a very, very pronounced way. If you support revolutions, you're not moderate. If you don't support the absolute obedience to the ruler, you're not moderate. If you support al-Sahwa, or if you share some ideas of al-Sahwa, of the 1990s, then you're not moderate. You see it in all the actions taken within the Ministry of Education, Islamic Affairs, but also in the media, and so on and so forth. So there is this political dimension also that is pronounced by the actions taken themselves. As I said, no doctrinal debate, but rather arrests and rather imprisonment than anything else. Does this mean that, because that the religious dimension or religious actors are simply tamed or domesticated, as one of my colleagues used the term? Yes, they are tamed and domesticated, but they are made to become part of this process of moderating Saudi Islam. So today, you had in the value system of Saudi Arabia, instead of having a hegemony of Islam, you have those same Islamic actors, but preaching about patriotism, about the belonging to the Saudi state, about Saudi citizenship, about what it means to be Saudi. And again, the constant of absolute obedience to the ruler. So instead of just asking them to go home or arresting them or simply shutting down some of the institutions, even the religious police is still there, but it is still there to use that new narrative and assert it by doing, as I said, some public events about patriotism, some public events about, good citizenship. A key also in this moderation, in this effort to make Saudi Islam more moderate, is visibility. Before 2015, all previous Saudi kings since September 11th, mainly King Abdullah, to be honest, tried to make Saudi Islam more moderate, right? But it was done in an incremental way, and it was done in a more sometimes subtle way when it came to reorganizing institutions of the religious establishment, such as the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, but also Education, and Ministry of Justice, and so on and so forth. Today, this is no longer the case. Sorry, there is this will to make the changes, again, to use, a very common sentence, in your face. So in addition to the real changes that I can discuss in the Q&A inside those ministries that I mentioned, there is an emphasis on delivering the message to the Saudi public and delivering the message to the West that things are changing in Saudi Arabia. So as much as it is important to curb the powers of Saudi judges, who are actually really clerics, there is also an emphasis on social liberalization. There is also an emphasis on the status of women in the public and of the public sphere. And this is something that is new in this approach to, proving and showing and making Saudi Islam a more moderate Islam. All this also comes within a larger project that we have to talk about here that was not necessarily mentioned or was not necessarily the case before, which is Vision 2030. A lot of the actions taken within Vision 2030 have an indirect impact on the religious sphere. So, for example, as was mentioned, the bureaucracy, making the bureaucracy more efficient, more professional, and with an emphasis on skills rather than on, religious knowledge, including inside the ministries where religion used to be hegemonic. And we see this very clearly, for example, in the cases of the reforms inside the Ministry of Justice right now. And so these also the projects of culture, having culture and the Ministry of Culture fill in the space left by religion in the public sphere. At the same time, to generate revenue for the state. All these are parts of a larger project and actually feed into, again, making Saudi Islam and showing Saudi Islam as being more moderate without necessarily having, as I said, the real doctrinal debate that would invalidate some of the previous interpretations of the Wahhabi doctrine. This is also happening. All these efforts are happening in parallel to changes in Saudi foreign policy in the Islamic sphere. Since 2015, Saudi foreign policy in general has become very much pragmatic, more pragmatic than before, in the sense that yes, Arab and Islamic countries remain the major and the main recipients of Saudi aid, but right now it is more institutionalized. There has been a rehabilitation of the institutions working to deliver financial aid to other countries, and also with a more focus on interest. The Saudi largesse of Islamic solidarity, if you want, is being redefined. What does it mean when we give you money and we ask for Islamic solidarity and influence? What does it mean? And this is done at the same time of, as mentioned by one of my colleagues, of keeping the old institutions such as the World Muslim League, for example, but making it deliver that same new discourse, that same new way of action, in the sense that, for example, now there is relations between Saudi Arabia and other Muslim countries are to be conducted more on a state-to-state level, rather than emphasizing the transnational relations that Saudi Arabia used to master with the Muslim communities inside other countries directly. There has also been an emphasis on making those same institutions like the World Muslim League or new institutions like the King Salman Center for Humanitarian Relief purposely and in a very publicized way reach beyond Muslim communities abroad, emphasizing that cooperation, collaboration, and even aid is not limited to Muslims abroad, but also to non-Muslims, whether communities or also countries. There are, of course, a lot of tensions, under all this project being undertaken right now in Saudi Arabia. First of all, the fact that, as I said, religious actors and religious institutions that used to carry and deliver the same narrative that is now being called, that is now being changed because it was never called extremist. Wahhabism is not called extremist. It's rather the brotherhood and the Sahwa. They are being kept. And so the question becomes, are they being kept because there is a concern that, shutting them down would upset large sectors of society or the most extremist sectors of society in a way that could produce a backlash or violence? Or are they being kept in case there is a need to reverse the actions that have been taken? So that's a question. Second of all of this, as my colleagues have mentioned, this tendency toward moderation came really as a reaction to September 11th attacks. And so, the origin of these actions remains outside demand for this, including the project of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman since 2015. However, to kind of localize the project and make it more authentic, as I said before, there is a constant emphasis that, we've always been moderate since 1979. It has never been our fault. It's the other's fault. It's a foreign thing. Finally, in a sense, Saudi Arabia, has always been able to maintain this special status in the Islamic world, of course, thanks to its policy and the allocation of resources in cultivating those kind of transnational relations with Muslim communities abroad, but also because it hosts the two mosques, but also because Saudi Arabia has always had its own brand of Islam, right? It's what I started my presentation by saying. It always presented itself as being the embodiment of Islam. And so it applies Islam in the strictest way possible. There is today reluctance to completely abandon those old practices that were deemed to be not moderate, because Saudi Islam still needs to have its own brand, because Saudi Arabia still needs this network of influence and is not ready to abandon it. And so we see right now a coexistence between old practices and foreign and also domestic politics with the new ones. Again, transition periods are supposed to be hybrid, but there is also the sense that there isn't a new project, there isn't a new brand of Saudi Islam that would make it as special as it was before when you compare it to Egyptian Islam, Moroccan Islam, or other. So I think those reforms and those changes have their limits for the political reasons that I mentioned before domestically, but also because of this need in the market of, Islamic ideas, where you have new competitors, state and non-state competitors, that there's still a thinking of how will Saudi Islam distinguish itself without being deemed as being extremist and without holding Saudi Arabia responsible for any kind of terrorist attack abroad. I will stop here and I'll be more than happy to delve into more details in the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Yasmin. Such fascinating developments going on in the Saudi context. Again, a reminder that you can enter questions for our speakers in the Q&A panel using the Q&A button from your Zoom controls. We always knew this panel would get a great response, and indeed the questions are already well into the double digits. So let me, without further ado, go ahead and turn things over to our final speaker, Anel Sheline from the Quincy Institute, who I think is going to help us to start to contextualize some of these issues in the context of US foreign and national security policy. Anel, over to you.
Thanks so much, Peter, and thanks to all of my colleagues whose work has been really inspirational for me as I work on these issues as well. So I wanted to build, in fact, on something that Yasmin said. Wait, one question. Can you all see me? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Sorry, I couldn't see myself. So something Yasmin in her comments just now was emphasizing the notion of the market and sort of this, and as my colleagues have described, there is this competition to sort of assert. I had a paper or a piece that was published recently. The title was "More Moderate Than Thou," and so this kind of competition to win the effort to be seen as the most moderate. And so I'll focus in the beginning of my comments on, if this is a market, where did this demand come from? And so emphasizing the role of the United States. Clearly some of these efforts preceded 9/11, but as my colleagues have said, 9/11 was really a critical juncture in shifting the overall religious framework and the United States as sort of particularly at the time of 9/11, still sort of the unipolar power within the global system and continues to be the predominant military power in the Middle East, that all of these countries in the Middle East and North Africa really did have to pay attention to when the United States sort of put out this demand for so-called moderate Islam. So I think one really important thing to think about is to remember that after 9/11, the Bush administration's initial focus was on democracy promotion, and Bush had the so-called domino theory that if the US removed Saddam Hussein and helped install a democratic government, that this would cause a chain reaction whereby other authoritarian governments throughout the region would also give way to democracy. And this was correct. The Bush administration had identified authoritarianism as state violence as one factor driving some individuals to acts of violent extremism. However, the US was also aware that democracy in this context would likely end up empowering Islamists. This occurred, for example, in Gaza in 2006 when Hamas won elections there, after which the US had to quickly scramble to declare them illegitimate because Hamas was characterized as a terrorist group. So the Bush administration had a dilemma here, and Arab governments were eager to shift the blame away from their own failures and abuses and to scapegoat Islam. This both served the purpose of reducing attention from their own responsibility, driving violent extremism. And it also shifted the blame onto their main source of political opposition, which tended to be Islamist groups. And given existing levels of Islamophobia in the US, partly left over from memories of the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the hostage crisis, which happened, I think, before many of the people on this webinar were alive or particularly aware, but it continues to be sort of a salient memory for many Americans. So the point was, many Americans lacked interest in discerning between an Islamist and a terrorist. So it's interesting to note that Pakistan was actually one of the first countries to target an American audience with the notion of moderate Islam, or what specifically was termed enlightened moderation. So Pervez Musharraf, the president of Pakistan at the time, published in the Washington Post in June of 2004 a plea for enlightened moderation, which he defined as having two components. The first involved Muslims shunning militancy and pursuing socioeconomic uplift. And the second called on the US to seek to resolve all political disputes with justice and to aid in the socioeconomic betterment of the deprived Muslim world, end quote. And in this, Musharraf reinforced America's self-image as the global arbiter of justice, as well as the state bearing responsibility for the rest of the world. And Musharraf makes no mention of Pakistan and his own responsibility as president, or his country's role in providing a safe haven to Taliban fighters escaping US forces in neighboring Afghanistan. Instead, he speaks in broad generalities on behalf of all Muslims, describes their allegedly pitiful plight, and begs for US assistance. And this makes sense because at the time, he was probably worried that the US might have been about to shift attention from Afghanistan, and more specifically to address the ways that Pakistan was sort of undermining US efforts to deal with the Taliban, a war that the US obviously continues to be engaged in. But fairly quickly, and by this time it had already happened, the Bush administration, as I mentioned, had shifted attention to Iraq. And this notion of needing to overthrow Saddam Hussein and to reinforce democracy. And yet very quickly, we did see much more emphasis on Islam as the main problem, which goes back to the opening comments from my colleague Anne, emphasizing this distinction between a good Muslim and bad Muslim, and this whole sort of creation of so-called moderate Islam as this sphere within which various governments would compete. So I'll shift now to talking a little bit more about the conferences and summits that have focused on themes such as pluralism, tolerance, and coexistence. And to emphasize that such declarations offer an opportunity to members of the official religious establishment to reassert their religious authority that over the past 100 years or so, many of these countries, as has the rest of the world, have had expanded access to education and literacy, and as a result, the authority of religious figures has declined as people have been able to read the Quran themselves and to in more recent years access cassettes, for example, now the internet. And so they've had less reason to necessarily go to their local imam or their local mosque as their sort of single source of religious information. So as a result, these state-affiliated religious officials have seen their authority undermined. And as my colleagues have described, the response to this has been sort of greater bureaucratization of the religious sphere, as Anne described so eloquently. But the issue with this is because these state-affiliated religious officials do not tend to be seen as authoritative, particularly among individuals that reject the legitimacy of the authoritarian regimes they represent. And furthermore, efforts to ground these declarations in the Quran or the Hadith or other texts can also prove challenging because foundational religious texts of all faiths are rife with contradictions and can be used to justify incongruous behaviors. So even if a declaration issued by religious scholars is grounded in authoritative and unambiguous scriptures, the individuals that issue them have few mechanisms to enforce their edicts. So in a piece I wrote for the Berkeley Center, I compare the tendency to issue statements like the Mecca document and the Marrakesh Declaration or the Amman message, for example. They sort of resemble statements issued by the United Nations, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. But the difference here is that, you know, the UN was set up, was designed to not have an enforcement mechanism. It was more to sort of assert shared principles, and then various countries could sort of buy into those declarations or not. But when similar sort of sounding declarations are issued in the name of Islam, they emulate the conceptual simplicity of UN declarations. But seeking to reduce a vast and complex religious tradition to a single principle such as tolerance will only satisfy an uninformed student of religion. When Muslim religious leaders seek to derive authority from UN-style declarations, but do so by stripping down the nuances of Islam, they lose legitimacy of both. These tend to rely on cherry-picked versions of historical religious documents while ignoring more exclusivist or problematic aspects found within Islamic texts, similar to, you know, those found within Christian texts, for example. Lots of cherry-picking happening there as well. And this overly simplistic engagement with complex texts reinforces the tendency to view Muslims as bound by ancient scriptures rather than capable of reinterpreting their religious traditions in a manner that accords with their own individual values. So my point is that international symmetry and this proliferation of declarations, especially those that sort of resemble declarations from organizations like the UN, may seem like a relatively harmless opportunity to affirm the relevance of participants and, you know, bland notions of tolerance. However, while the UN may be able to retain legitimacy, even if its declarations are not always effective, making a declaration on the basis of an overly simplified Islam that ignores the nuances of religious texts is likely to appeal only to non-Muslims, while alienating Muslims looking for real engagement with their religious tradition. And again, this is all sort of taking place within a context of American demand for moderate Islam, and that most Americans, as I said, are unwilling or uninterested to sort of dig into the nuances themselves. Which is part of why I think efforts by the Berkeley Center, for example, to promote greater religious education for an American audience are really crucial. So a final point I want to make here is to actually draw attention to the work of one of Peter's PhD students. John Hoffman recently published a piece where he talked about the sort of shifting away from a focus on the United States. As an American, you know, I tend to sort of view everything through the American lens, but to shift more towards Russia and China and the extent to which they view their own Muslim minority populations as potentially a deep source of political instability, and how they have turned to China, or how they have turned to Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Egypt in particular as the sort of axis of moderate Islam, building on, you know, Saudi religious authority, Egyptian religious authority, and then the Emirates sort of willingness to transform their society and perform moderate Islam, as well as the recent Abraham declarations wherein the UAE normalized with Israel was also a very key marker of so-called moderation. Pre 9/11 willingness to engage with Israel was often sort of one of those markers of so-called moderation. And so Russia and China turned to these countries to promote their so-called moderate Islam, to help train their imams. And what's been fascinating is to notice the extent to which these three Arab countries have not condemned actions against Chinese Muslims in particular, as well as Russian Muslims, and even sort of celebrating the ways that China is devastating their Uyghur community and other Chinese Muslim communities, that we've seen no outcry from actors like Saudi Arabia, and in fact praise for what China is doing, which is quite fascinating. So moving forward, as the US continues to operate within a more multipolar global order, and China and Russia continue to be increasingly important global actors, I think this just reinforces the importance of what is happening with this so-called promotion of moderate Islam, that it's not just something, you know, a sort of nation branding strategy where states compete, but really has very real implications, not only for members of Islamist oppositions within these countries, but for Muslims all over the world whose interpretation of their own religion has been shifted, and also who are subject to ongoing state violence. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anel. And we went ahead and put a link to that article by John Hoffman that you mentioned in the chat boxes, as well as your declaration proliferation piece. So we happily have a full half hour available to us to talk through some of the many questions that have come in, and they really kind of run the full gamut. So there's something here for all of you. I will cluster the questions a bit just to kind of make our pathway through them as efficient as possible. There are a couple of questions that are kind of similar to each other, so I may kind of combine those. So let me start by circling back to the beginning of the panel. Ani, there are a couple of questions here specifically relating to Turkey that I wanted to start off with. So we have one from Christos Papaluka, who just asks, what is the role of religion in Turkish foreign policy, and how does it fit into Erdogan's revisionist foreign policy and rhetoric? I think looks like Maha El-Ghanedi would like to take you up on your offer to address the question of the Gülen's Hizmet movement and how we should think about religious soft power in that context. What does this soft power look like, and what is its aim beyond defending Gülen himself? So go ahead and start with those two to you.
Sure, thank you. And thanks for those questions. So I'm actually going to start with the second question about the Gülenists. So what the soft power looks like, at least pre-coup attempt in 2016, was mainly focused on things like education. So the Gülen movement built schools and dorms and training centers for students first in Turkey, and then expanded these around the world to other countries, many Muslim majority countries, but also to the United States, where they opened up a number of schools. And these were not religion focused. They tended to focus on training students in science and math and technology. But then there was always a kind of religion focus on teaching about liberal Islam and moderate Islam in the background. So, in the dorms or in the social events that happened. Alongside of this, they had they sponsored conferences and dialogues among civilizations, which they called them, to get different religious groups talking to each other, and to promote this idea of Turkish Islam being a very moderate and liberal form of Islam. And also sponsored trips for academics to Turkey to show them around and show them what Turkey was like. So all sorts of efforts to get this message out. I don't think it was just about defending or promoting Gülen. I do think that there was a general kind of Turkish nationalism behind all of this. The Gülen movement, I don't think was only focused on itself. I say was because since the attempted coup was blamed on Gülenists, the movement has gone mostly underground. So we don't hear a lot from them right now. People who remained in Turkey have been imprisoned. And so they don't have the influence that they used to have. They used to be allies with the AKP when the party first gained power in 2002, and had a lot of influence, infiltrated this bureaucracy, right, that we've been talking about, and really had some important positions within that bureaucracy and helped to frame the way that Turkey was framing its foreign policy, which gets to this next question, where we see this change. So when Turkey first, when the AKP first took power, we see this kind of Turkey looking more towards the West, trying to become a member of the EU, really framing itself, not the AKP, not as an Islamist party, but as a conservative democratic party like the Republican Party of George W. Bush, and really framing itself as this kind of liberal version of Islam. Once things soured with the EU and it was clear that they were never going to accept Turkey as a member state, the shift turned more towards the East, you could say. And this kind of shift was accompanied by the AKP trying to get more Islamist policies passed within Turkey. And it was successful in some senses, most of the time, not so much. And it's, but the instead of pursuing legislation now, I think what the government has been doing is kind of going after this bureaucracy, right? And really trying to give it more teeth. and almost adopting the kind of Muslim Brotherhood strategy of Islamicizing from below. I think I'll stop there to give other people time to talk. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Ani. So this next question, I think wasn't kind of directed at any particular speaker. It refers to a phenomenon that I think is particularly pronounced, perhaps in the Moroccan context. So Anne, maybe we can start with you, but I'd invite all of you on the panel who'd like to respond to it to please do so. So this is from Christopher Bolin, who asks, what are the prospects for regimes to adopt strategies to openly incorporate Islamist political movements into the government? Where have these strategies succeeded or failed, and why?
I just want to read the question myself to make sure I read it already once, but one more time. I think I have an ideological conflict with the question, so maybe I'll just discuss that. I don't know exactly what's meant by the language of incorporation. What are the prospects for regimes to adopt strategies to openly incorporate Islamist political movements into the government? I'm not sure if there's a normative assumption in the question that it's a good thing or a strategic move to incorporate Islamist movements into the government. If we look at the Moroccan case, trying to think where I would draw the parallel. So incorporation could mean facilitating or allowing electoral involvement, which the Moroccan regime has done in a selective way, in ways that were convenient. So at times when the major Islamist party, PJD, has been successful in the voting booth, scholars, including the work of my colleague Matthew Buehler, have pretty, I think, convincingly demonstrated that this was allowed explicitly through the way in which electoral rules were written specifically for that election. So times when we see Islamists come to power, at least in the Moroccan context, it was allowed and partially facilitated by the regime on purpose. And so that's one way to think about incorporation. Another way to think about incorporation would be in terms of like encouraging recruitment into the bureaucracy from Islamist movements. And I guess I feel a discomfort with the framing of the question, because it seems to me as if it's coming from a place of desiring to weaken those movements. And I actually think, and maybe what I'll do here is pivot to my own thoughts on this subject, which when Anel was talking, I realized I didn't say the concluding paragraph of what I wanted to say. So actually moved to authority, because that was the piece that was really missing from all of our presentations. So let me see if I can wrap this all up together. Really, the issue with this kind of state-sponsored religious moderation is the way it banalizes, simplifies, de-diversifies the religious field in a way that makes it very boring and uninteresting to citizens, and perhaps is pushing people to the fringes. I think what we really want to see is a really vibrant, diverse, competitive religious landscape in all the countries of the Middle East. And so I don't see Islamist movements as groups that need to be co-opted, incorporated, domesticated, or in other ways contained. I think Islamist movements are just part of the mobilization on behalf of religion that you would expect in a healthy society, and that the ideal would be an institutional and a legislative framework that facilitates as much free competition in that arena as possible, and that diversifies that arena, as opposed to treating actors that have religious motivations as inherently suspicious or in need of being controlled.
No, thank you very much, Anne. And you're absolutely right that there is a certain amount of ambiguity with respect to the normative valence kind of the question there. So thank you for kind of answering it so fully. I think Yasmin wanted to add something as well. And then of course, we'll see if any of our other speakers would like to respond to this one as well. Yasmin, over to you.
So I will not take issue with the assumption. I haven't honestly read the the question, but you know, the first thing that comes to my mind in such questions is when put in the Saudi context, is that what you can deduce from the Saudi official narrative today is to say that, you know, all strategies to incorporate Islamist movements, especially political Islamist movements, is bad. And of course, in the official narrative today, there is no holding the state, the Saudi state or the Saudi authorities responsible for incorporating the Muslim Brotherhood or the Sahrawis into the ministry. But at the same time, there is this narrative that it was a bad idea. They were the source of radicalization, and that today the state is after them, kicking them out and, you know, preventing them from teaching in schools or universities or preaching in mosques. But what's also happening is that just like they were used by the state at some point, those Sahrawis and the Muslim Brotherhood, today you have your other you know, movements or other currents, Islamist currents, that are used to counter the old ones without it being an open strategy. So you hear very much a lot these days the talk about the madkhalis, right? You hear a lot of talk about the jamis, and I owe this to a Saudi colleague of mine who you know, drew my attention to the fact that today there is this push of these madkhalis and jamis, the ones that are very aggressive on leaving politics to the ruler and forbidding the public from discussing politics, that these are the ones that are being pushed into mosques, into positions in the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, into schools and universities. So to push against any kind of political thinking, Islamist political thinking. So I would say that on the one hand, you deduce from the Saudi experience that, oh, it's a bad idea to incorporate Islamist movements into you know, the state. On the other hand, they are still doing it, but by incorporating those who would say, you know, absolutely no politics is allowed in Islam.
Thank you, Yasmin. Would others on the panel like to respond on this point at all? If not, we will just move on then. So Stacey, I've got a pair of questions for you from Fafar Maita, who asked several questions. I'll just pick a couple of them. He asks for your thoughts on why there was such a relatively high number of Jordanian volunteer fighters who went to join ISIS, and is also asking, I think, a question that's essentially about, you know, whether you perceive the particular narratives that the Jordanian government and religious institutions, official religious institutions, seek to project about moderate Islam. Do you kind of buy the narrative, I guess? Is it real?
That's great. Thank you. Those are two really very interesting questions, and I'm just going to answer them briefly, so we have time to have a, you know, more discussion. In terms of the relatively high numbers, I suppose I think that actually the answer is geography, rather than any particular unique push or pull factors for Jordanians. So geography, proximity, border policy. Then for the question, is it real? I thought this was, you know, I think this is a really interesting question, and, you know, not to be postmodern about it, you know, well, is anything real? But I think if we were having this conversation in, say, the 1970s, we wouldn't even be having a panel on moderation, because this is, you know, in some ways it's nothing. It doesn't mean anything. It is jargon, and all you can do as scholars and analysts is analyze what people do. So, you know, in some ways, I think this is both moderation as a concept is both nothing, and also it's something, and it's something because of what people do with it. And the fact that and I was interested in what Anil had to say, and others have said about, the Americans kind of passing this ball and the ball getting, bounced around in the region and used, and it being a market to attract in funding. I think it's a discourse that people play with, and you can study if you're, properly methodologically triangulating your work. You can study, how this discourse functions, and you also have to always be critical about that. It's not a thing. That actually all you can understand is how people use it, what they think about it, and then what they do. But I think we can study the discourse, and then we can also again study the kind of habitus of people, and that we're studying the actions of populations and the actions of governments. And so in somewhere like Jordan, so the population will take up and use this language. Now, is it because they're, just duped by the government? No, I don't think so. So you have to use not only the official discourse, but how people use it in their everyday lives, and ultimately what they do beyond the discourse. So thanks for those questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Stacy. We have a question that kind of picks up on where you left off there about how these kinds of terms and concepts circulate kind of at the level of popular public discourse that we'll get to a little later if we have time. But I would like to turn now to a question that comes from Ulrich Nitschke. Ulrich, it's great to see you. I hope you're doing well. He asks, how much is the state religious institution relationship impacting the 10-year civil war in Syria? For those of you who maybe follow developments there, are there any new trends that, for example, Islam or Islamic narratives are being more or less instrumentalized in the context of that conflict? How are refugees affected by this? Some influence from the wide range of political orientations from surrounding countries that to some extent contradict each other, and where religion fits into that. So would any of you be up for taking that one? Anel, please.
So I'll take a stab at it, although I do not have a deep knowledge of Syria. So if anybody does, please weigh in. But I do think it's just interesting to notice the extent to which, especially after 9/11, there was sort of this tendency to emphasize the Ba'athist regimes as a counterweight, that you saw justifications also, and then later on, especially in the context of the post-Arab Spring, and as Syria unfortunately was devolving into civil war, you did see apologists for the Syrian regime saying, well, they're a secular state and Bashar al-Assad is protecting religious minorities, whereas ISIS obviously is murdering religious minorities. That he himself is a religious minority, so he's interested in protecting them. And that this sort of was the notion that Baathism or sort of Arab nationalism was a counterbalance to Islamists. And this goes back. Obviously, I think some of the questions perhaps reflect the fact that we didn't get into the whole sort of history of a lot of this, which was sort of the rise of Islamist movements in response to leftist movements. It's sort of in the context of the Cold War, Arab governments found leftist movements really concerning. I mean, Anne has done a whole lot about this, of sort of an Islamic solution that became an Islamic problem, as she says, where the states tried to empower Islamist groups because they were seen as politically quietist. Whereas relatively soon, as they gained more power, they became more interested in sort of, expanding the role of Islam in the public sphere, and in some cases, overthrowing the existing governments that were usually continued to oppress them quite strenuously. And so all of that is sort of context within which you had a few of these existing, so-called secular regimes that were seen as sort of an answer to Islamist movements. And again, especially in the context of the post-Arab Spring, where you did see Islamist groups come to power, and you saw a lot of these countries demonstrating much more fear of the possibility that these Islamist movements could in fact overthrow them, as we saw in the cases of Tunisia and Egypt. So all of that is broader than necessarily really digging into the Syrian case with which I'm not as familiar, but I do know that the Assad regime has used this justification of, well, we're secular, and you're only, which again, and the whole narrative has been the only alternative to these existing ruling governments are these scary Islamist terrorists, and sort of lumping that together as the same thing, and the lack of sort of the international community's ability or willingness to sort of pull those apart and acknowledge that yes, democracy in these contexts is probably going to look more Islamist, but that isn't a scary thing necessarily. It's only scary when they adopt violence, largely because they've been subjected to so much state violence. So apologies for not having more depth on Syria, but that's sort of a context.
No, thanks. Now, I have enormous admiration for anyone who dares to try to answer questions about Syria these days. Oh, you audience naughty people coming in with such incredibly good questions right at the very end. Very frustrating. Okay, let me turn to another kind of opportunity for twinning questions. This will be a matter of, I think, combining a question from Christos Papaluka again with one from Alar Oljam. Alar, it's great to see you. Let me add that to the list here. So this is sort of about inviting your thoughts on the transatlantic comparison in terms of the orientations of American and European policymakers in terms of how they see religion or religious leaders in proximity to political power, given the rather different norms and histories of the relationship between religion and political power in the United States versus Europe, or the kind of varying levels of comfort and different norms around the presence of religion in public space, for example, that you see in the US versus Europe. Do we see this reflected in different attitudes and orientations of North American and European policymakers towards these questions in the Middle East? And Alar's gloss on that question is to ask what to think about the promotion of moderate Islam by European leaders such as French President Emmanuel Macron. Do you think it's the responsibility of the state to recruit and train imams toward this end? Obviously a rather different kind of question, but one that is also kind of looking for some reflections on the European context. So who might want to take those up? Stacy.
I can say a few things quickly. I think there was a larger difference closer to 9/11, and there becomes less of a difference as we go along. I think closer to 9/11, Europeans generally thought they were perhaps a bit better and a bit more understanding because of the colonial, the imperial experience, which that's not the same as understanding, but that's the justification. I mean, the other thing I would say is that Europe is obviously very diverse. So Macron's perspective would be different from how things look in Germany, in Denmark, in the UK, in Spain, in Poland. It's difficult to even generalize about a European experience, let alone an American experience. You can talk about the EU tracking with some policy initiatives that have been similar to the State Department, but in terms of overall attitude and institutional structures, now I think they're very similar.
Okay, thanks, Stacey. Yeah, please, Yasmin.
Good. Yeah, I'll add something, is that it is also interesting to see how the Islamic issues or religion issues in the West, be it Europe or the United States, get internalized in the countries to serve the political purposes of the regime. how what's going on in France is presented, for example, to the Saudi audience, or even seen, perceived, intuitively by the Saudi audience, and how what is happening in the United States is perceived and presented and framed. In the case of Saudi Arabia, the common theme again is always, it's the Muslim Brotherhood. In the case, and it's again the same fault lines. So you have those, Twitter campaigns who were, seeing Macron as being offensive and seeing France as offending Islam and offending the Prophet, right? And then saying, and then those pro-government saying, oh no, what Macron is doing is actually fight the Muslim Brotherhood. And finally, Europe understands that the Muslim Brotherhood is bad. At the same thing, when the Biden administration came into power, you had again in Saudi-controlled media all the narrative about how they are close to the Muslim Brotherhood and how they are under the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood. So I think a fascinating dimension about this is that despite the differences within Europe that was just mentioned, despite the difference between Europe and the United States, when it is framed and it arrives all the way to those countries, there is the local context that actually shapes how it is perceived and how it is reacted to. But something I hear very often, for example, from Europeans, but also here in the United States when it comes to Saudi Arabia, is that anything that is done to curtail and tame, the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia is good. And so I always hear the sentence about, oh, but the Crown Prince, he has a vision. It is really great because he's making Islam more moderate. So that's something in common that I hear, in the US or in Europe.
Thanks so much, Yasmin. If no one else on the panel would like to respond to that, I'm going to, let's see, looking at the clock here. Okay, here's what I'm going to propose we do. We have a couple of questions that I'm going to rather clumsily squash together because they're different questions, but I'm going to project a certain level of continuity onto them, at least in one aspect. So we'll take those two questions. And there's also a final question that is kind of a look ahead type question that is a nice opportunity, I think, to let us just go around the virtual room and hear from all of you with respect to, in terms of kind of some closing thoughts. So the two questions I'm putting together, one of them circles back to the point that we'd already touched on about, questions about whether norms and concepts, discourses of wasatiyya are, circulate and have significance and meaning in popular societal conversation, or whether they're really kind of just discursive devices employed by official institutions. I know, Anel, for example, this is something you've definitely looked at in your work. So, how do ordinary Muslims, Maha El-Ghanedi asks, feel about these ideas of, moderate Islam or moderation? The clumsy squash I'm going to do here is to bring in Ferial Salem. Ferial, it's great to see you here. I hope you're doing well. Who makes a very interesting point that there are different national intellectual genealogies of discussion and kind of conversation about moderation. So she says, I'm wondering if we might make more connections to the credibility or viability of discourses of moderation, make connections to the way in which the intellectual history of Islamic thought in each of the regions is discussed today and how they differ. Are some more performative than others? So for instance, the rationalist Ottoman intellectual tradition from which Turkey draws from is markedly different from the Wahhabi movement that became rooted in Saudi Arabia in the last century, or Morocco, where Sufi orders are closely connected to Islamic practice in ways that we would not see in Jordan, or Salafi revivalist movements based in textualist approaches among some thinkers of the Ikhwan in post-1980s Egypt. So that's the question, the two questions that I'm kind of putting together. And then the final round the room opportunity comes from Ezekiel Max, who asks, what do the panelists think will be the next developments in the instrumentalization of moderate Islam for geopolitical purposes? So that's kind of the look ahead question. So I thought what we would do then is just kind of start at the top of the panel, go back around and invite each of you to respond to kind of either or both of those questions, or indeed to just offer any closing thoughts that you'd like to based on the conversation. And Ani, can we start with you?
Sure. Thank you for those questions. And, we have, I think, like a minute left. So I'm going to just say kind of address, I guess, the final question. I don't see this. I don't see a shift away from the moderate Islam trend. The name might change, but once you go into this bureaucratization, it's really hard to, once you regulate, it's really hard to deregulate. And we see it happening, the previous question about Macron trying to create a French version of Islam, we see it happening in Europe as well. And so from my perspective, I see this kind of as a trend that's going to continue. Obviously, it's going to take different forms as the situation changes around the world and different alliances emerge. But I kind of see it as something that's going to continue at least the same rate that we've been seeing it currently. Thank you.
Thank you, Ani. Anne, over to you for responses and or closing thoughts.
Yeah, I was thinking about Jeffrey Herbst's work as Ani was talking about the ratchet effect that he argued existed. In times of war, states raise their taxes, and then in times of peace, they don't lower those taxes again. So war can function as a critical juncture that shapes the strength of the state over time. In a similar way, the war on terror has been this kind of a critical juncture in which states claimed they needed to take greater control of their religious field, and they were broadly supported in that by a host of international actors, observers, and states. And we're not going to see the deregulation of the religious field as the security discourse changes and focuses on other topics. So what we'll see is increased levels of religious regulation across the region. And that is what a lot of the data coming out is showing, that this regulation is like continuing to grow, continuing to spread, continuing to intensify. And so what I think we'll see is continued stalled democratization efforts as religious elites, who are some of the only people in the population who would have legitimacy to lead pro-democracy movements, continue to not do so. And I expect to see people get really bored by these banal state-sponsored Islamic doctrines, be drawn to what would be considered in the context of moderate Islam, the fringes, for looking for more innovative, interesting, creative religious discourse. And then I think the state is going to try to pivot and find a way to absorb that as well. We see this in the Moroccan case with the shift in their language around Salafism, from Salafism is bad in 2003 to Kulna Salafiyun. We're all Salafis as of 2015. Thank you, Tawfiq, for clarifying that. So I think we'll see a similar pivot, whereas wherever the interesting ideas and thinkers start to pop up in the Islamic world, the state is going to try to co-opt them. And so religious elites are really in a tough bind right now. All their opportunity in most countries is tied to state-sponsored religious institutions. And if they say anything interesting, they draw even more attention to themselves. So I think the really strategic religious thinkers are going to lay low. There's going to be something rumbling below the surface, and we won't know what it is until it comes to the fore.
Really interesting insight, and thank you. Thank you. Stacy, let's turn to you.
I like Dan's crystal ball projection. I thought that was, I think that's very intriguing about the idea that that more creativity is going to come out of what is, maybe a rather boring state-sponsored moment. But I wanted to take up your first question, Peter, about whether this idea of moderation, or wasatiyya means anything to people. And generally these big concepts don't mean much to people because people just get on living their everyday lives. In Jordan, for example, that people will talk about the conviviality of living with others, Muslims and Christians, for example. Or they'll talk about a Jordanian nationalism, but that doesn't necessarily track to this kind of analytic academic concept of moderation that we're using. So it will be interesting if as Anil put it, when the market maybe dies down, what kinds of new forms of being and language and being together will happen. I mean, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about, what these things actually mean for domestic pluralism, and I think that's a really fascinating thing. Particularly in the Gulf and interfaith things that are happening on the ground in the Gulf. That would be something to watch in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Stacy. Yasmin, over to you.
To be honest, I don't have many things to add to what colleagues have just said. I mean, it's they make really good points, but maybe, quick remarks is, what does moderation mean in the daily lives? I again, like, who's the ordinary Muslim, to be honest? Like, I mean, there are so many types of ordinary Muslims, and these are all authoritarian contexts. So even when every time I read that there's a poll in Saudi Arabia and a credible poll, I ask myself, what is a credible poll in the Saudi context? So to be honest, I think I wouldn't be able to answer this, but definitely there is an overuse and abuse of this term of moderation in the media in an attempt to try to impose a certain definition of moderation on the people and to make this the one that is actually being used and being, if you want, internalized by the public. In terms of the future developments, I think that this language and narrative on moderation will continue because again, in the cases of Morocco or even Saudi Arabia or even Egypt, the countries that have consider themselves to be regional powers that have to have an outside outreach. It is a capital of influence. It's yes, it's a market of ideas, but it's also influence. It's transnational influence that could be used against the states where Muslim communities exist. And so I think we will continue to see this discourse on moderation, but we will continue to see, hybrid practices between the old practices of supporting jihadis and extremists in countries like Somalia, for example, or elsewhere, and the new discourse and new practices and actions to, tame those kind of practices, tame the support to extremism, tame the support to terrorists.
Great, thank you very much, Yasmin. And last but by no means least, Anel, over to you for any final thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just to get to this question of how people perceive this, I think one thing that we didn't mention was that obviously that many of these Muslim communities, especially in the Middle East, many people were the victims of a lot of this violence. And so at least during a lot of my field work in Jordan and in Morocco and elsewhere, there was a demand for the state to prevent sort of extremist language. At the time I was doing my research, it was in the context of Daesh, and there was a lot of concern, especially in Jordan, as we've mentioned, that a lot of people were finding it appealing, and some people were traveling there. So although I think there is something of an existing narrative that sees all state-led discourse as lacking credibility, I think, in fact, for many ordinary people, they do see the state as a legitimate religious actor. They don't want a secular state. They do want the state to sort of promote values that they see as sort of contributing to broad social cohesion. But what they reject, they see so-called moderate Islam as being sort of this Western imposition. And a lot of the responses I heard from people was like, Islam is already moderate. You have this notion of wasatiyya within the Quran. You have numerous hadith where the Prophet was often actually criticizing Christians and sort of seeing them as cuckoo and extremists and, celibate, like, what weirdos. Whereas Muslims were supposed to be moderate, that was sort of the path of moderation, the Umm al-Wasata. This is what it meant to be a good Muslim. And so this notion that moderation has to be imposed on Islam from outside is often seen as illegitimate and sort of reflecting the sort of Western imperialism and ignorance and Islamophobia. I just to get to the question of where this is all going, I do worry. I had written down some notes, sorry, one sec. That I worry that it's going to undermine pluralism because the state is trying to assert control over the legitimate expression of Islam, sort of that Weberian, the state controls legitimate use of violence. And here the state is trying to say that only we can legitimately express Islam. So if you outlaw independent interpretations of Islam, only outlaws will interpret Islam independently. And this is contributing, as has been said before, to sort of the appeal of extremism. So it is in fact undermining pluralism and sort of the spaces within which, again, that I think Anne mentioned this, that you are going to see the appeal of these margins where because religion is lived and evolves. And so again, as I said in my comments, as sort of the state imposed Islam and this bureaucratized Islam is sort of ossified and somewhat dead. And, we all know bureaucracies are not super good at innovating. And so we will continue to see people seeking a more sort of robust and interesting and intellectually stimulating Islam that reflects their own lives and their own questions and experiences. And they're not going to find that in the state. And when they seek that, the state will treat them as terrorists, which again contributes to this cycle of violence. So I am really concerned. And again, another source of concern is this partnership between Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Egypt, all of which are very heavily invested in perpetuating violence against individuals who don't sort of bend the knee to their interpretation. So I, for one, am somewhat worried.
Okay, Anel, thank you so much. And certainly, I think we heard from a couple of you in those closing remarks, this idea that, even if we can't exactly tell what's going to happen next, we do need to keep our eye on the fact that even though these state discourses championing moderation and coexistence and tolerance are often framed in terms of pluralism, the actual securitizing and governmentalizing gestures involved may do anything but enhance pluralism going forward. Really interesting note and somber note to lead on, I think. So unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time today. I want to first and foremost thank all of our fantastic panelists for their remarks and insights. You saw from the heavy level of engagement in the Q&A box, there were easily 10 questions we didn't get to. And to those in the audience who posed those questions that weren't answered, my apologies. I do want to assure you that all of our panelists will see and will receive a copy of all the questions that were asked, so they will definitely see those. And there were many folks tuning in who were sending me private messages and direct messages throughout, telling me how much they really enjoyed the presentations today. My thanks as ever to Ruth Gopin, who coordinates all our events here at the Berkeley Center, and all the rest of the center staff for making these sessions possible. And finally, let me just thank all of you for joining us today. Take care, and we hope to see you at another event soon here at the Berkeley Center at Georgetown. Bye-bye, everyone. Take care.